All right. So today I wanted to talk about this Wired article by Jason Kay, which is about Brandon Sanderson. Brandon Sanderson is a famous and successful fantasy author. I actually don't know that much about him. I haven't really read much by him. I did a little bit of a shallow dive on him when he got floated around as a potential name to finish the Game of Thrones books in the event of George R. Martin's death. Just incidentally, Sanderson himself has said that he doesn't actually want to do that. There's just too much difference in the style and aesthetic, so that won't be happening. So don't look to that for hope as far as the Game of Thrones books. But anyway, the article that Kay wrote went viral because it's like really weirdly negative and personal in some very strange ways. Like, it's not uncommon to see articles that are written about people that are negative, and it's not unusual to see articles written about people's work that is negative. But this feels strangely intimate in some really bizarre ways, and it's just like a fascinating look at the psychology of the article writer as much as it is about Sanderson. Like, there's really very little insight into Sanderson, which I think is one of the reasons why people have been very negative about the article. I myself am not a fan of Sanderson's work from what I've seen. I'm kind of curious to check it out, but it's in a genre that I don't really care for, and he has a style that I would say that I don't really respond to. But one of the things that kind of surprised me was that the criticisms that the article raises are actually pretty shallow. They're all related to prose things, and they're things like, there's too much of a character nodding their head or too much of a character sighing or something like that. And that's all, in my opinion, fairly trivial stuff that an editor should be able to take care of. One of the unfortunate things about the current state of publishing is that a lot of the work that used to get done has been reduced. So there's been a lot of corners cut, and they're corners that I think most people wouldn't really notice at first. But when the more you read, the more you notice the typos start to creep in decade by decade. And it's getting to the point now where I think people are starting to realize, like, oh, yeah, editors are actually, you know, kind of good for something. I think somebody can be a little bit sloppy in terms of the way they write, but as long as they're decent at actually telling a story, I feel like a lot can be forgiven there. And just because somebody has the occasional clumsy sentence or phrase here and there, that doesn't mean that they aren't capable of writing good ones. And as much as Sanderson has written, I wouldn't be surprised if he's got the occasional nice turn of phrase here and there. There's probably like an interesting discussion to be had as far as the idea of people who like to read for prose and people who like to read for story. My impression is that people who read Sanderson are very much story people, but just because somebody's kind of only okay at one doesn't mean that they're not spectacular at the other. And one of the strange things about this article is it doesn't really get into the story stuff at all. This guy read like 18 or 19 of the books and apparently doesn't really discuss any of the actual story content really except in passing. But the article is called Brandon Sanderson is Your God. And it is kind of weirdly fixated on the Mormon angle. Sanderson is Mormon. But yeah, the article decides to like take some weird shots as far as the Mormon thing goes. Like, so let's jump in and check this out. Uh, Sanderson is extremely Mormon. True. Here we go. Could it be finally because he's a weirdo Mormon? So are Orson Scott Card and, oh, I guess, yeah, Glenn A. Larson. Mormon. I mean, only Orson Scott Card is also a weirdo. So yeah, that's just like very strange. There's some stuff here where he tries to tie it in at the end where he says, I press Sanderson on the moments he has felt the burning. He says they're too intimate, too special to talk about. That's fine. Let's talk about Mormonism in another way. Let's talk about it as it relates to fantasy because it's no secret. Mormonism is the fantasy of religion. So that's pretty strange, in my opinion. And there's an attempt to kind of tie this in where, let me find it. So much of Mormonism is about rules, so are his books, where miracles don't happen unless you put in the work. I mean, is Mormonism about rules more so than like any other religions? Are there a lot of religions that are like kind of freestyle, do whatever you want? I don't think that's the case. So that's pretty weird. I'm not really opposed to having a discussion about this. I mean, to some extent, I guess Sanderson kind of invites this criticism for himself, right? Because in this paragraph, it says Sanderson doesn't balk at the characterization. He agrees that's the gist and he knows where I'm going. He knows I want to know if what he's doing, writing fantasy books, is fundamentally in some way, some very central way, Mormon. Of course it is, he says, the world building, the gods incarnate, the systems of magic. So much of Mormonism is about rules, so are his books, where miracles don't happen unless you put in the work. I'm kind of at a disadvantage here because I actually haven't read, like I said, any of Sanderson's work. So, I mean, this may be entirely fair, and it's all just thinly disguised Mormon propaganda. But from what I've seen of like the synopses and stuff, I don't know if I necessarily buy that. I'm not necessarily opposed about having a discussion about how religion influences the work of a writer. I just don't think that the case is made here effectively. For example, I would have no problem discussing the influence that like Tolkien's Catholicism has on his work, but I mean, there's a lot more serious work being done to reflect on things like that. This just feels very cavalier and drive-by to me, frankly. But there's like a bunch of like really weird personal stuff in here. So, for example, I think there's a line about, yeah, here we go. He sits across from me in an empty restaurant, kind of lordly and sure of his insights, in a graphic t shirt and ill fitting blazer, which he says he wears because it makes him look professional. It doesn't. He isn't, unless the word means only believing in everything you say is worth saying. So, yikes. Sanderson talks a lot, but almost none of it is usable, quotable. I begin to think this is what I drove all the way from San Francisco to the suburbs of Salt Lake City in the freezing cold dead of winter for previously frozen dim sum and freeze-dried conversation. This must be why nobody writes about Brandon Sanderson. So, and a nice little cameo here. The conversation eventually turns to a theme park called Evermore, located just down the street. Though unaffiliated with Sanderson, it's Sandersonian to the core. You show up, hang around taverns, and embark on quests. We have to go, I say. But it's falling apart, everyone groans. I have no idea why the article writer is insisting that they have to go. That seems like a weird choice. There is a link to the Jenny Nicholson video, which I very much appreciate. I go back to the Elantris suite where I finally take that shower. There are multiple shower heads. I turn everything on. Water hits me from every angle. I don't cry, but I could. I do cry the next night, my last in Utah. We're down in Sanderson's below ground movie theater in plush red leather seats that not only recline, but also have adjustable headrests. He wants to show the specs off, so he plays the opening scene of The Greatest Showman. I don't tell him that while I like musicals, I hate The Greatest Showman, and especially Hugh Jackman. The scene starts, the chair shakes with otherworldly sound. When Hugh, lame Hugh, opens his mouth to sing, I can't help it, I burst into tears. So, yeah, that's kind of weird. Like the quickest way I can describe this is that this is like if the protagonist of the Wes Anderson movie Rushmore decided to write gonzo journalism about going to a fast food restaurant. Like, all of the insights that they have might not be wrong, but they're definitely not appropriate for the subject. It's just very strange. And I it's just kind of baffling. But I was thinking about this and I was trying to figure out what the problem I have with this article because I feel like I do have a problem with it and I don't think it's the same problem that a lot of other people have. And I think part of the issue is that I don't really know what the point of this story is, right? There's a little bit of look into Sanderson's personal life, but he doesn't really get into any detail about, like, what's his relationship with his family like. There's a lot of quotes here where it sort of gestures towards something that might be more interesting. Like, I would have liked to have seen more of a serious exploration of the impact of being Mormon that it has on his work, because just the idea that, like, the writer is God is, I have to actually kind of agree with the author here, not that profound of an insight, but he also uses it as basically the anchor for the end of his article to tie the whole thing together, so that's not great. But, yeah, I came away from this feeling really frustrated. And the Mormon thing doesn't really land for me either, because one of the things that I think everybody is very consistent about when they talk about Brandon Sanderson is that he is an exceedingly kind and generous and friendly and warm person. He's kind of in a tough position because, being Mormon, the church has taken some stances that I get the impression he probably doesn't really like, but that he feels obligated to go along with. And this ties into something a little bit larger as far as there's this idea that we need to call people out and talk about the bad stuff they're doing, and I guess I'm sympathetic to that in the abstract, but I guess I'm also very skeptical about the actual benefit that it does. I would distinguish between going after politicians and billionaires because I think they're people who have a very large impact, and I think they are what I would describe as legitimate targets for, condescension and derision and articles like this, actually. But somebody like Sanderson, as near as I can tell, is not even comparable to somebody like J.K. Rowling. He's not going out and actually advocating for overturning gay marriage, for example. And, actually, as far as the Mormon thing goes, I used to be Mormon. I was Mormon for a little bit as a teenager, and I have my issues with the church, not because of anything that happened to me. My experiences were almost entirely positive, but I am familiar with some of the stuff that happens at the larger level. And for a while, I was listening to this podcast called Mormon Stories, which I found pretty heartbreaking in terms of the way that the church can drive families apart. And there's also the Mormon Leaks scandal, which dropped a couple years ago, and that covered what I would describe as some pretty unchristlike behavior. But I don't really see what any of this has to do with Sanderson. And actually, in November of last year, the church actually declared their support of the Respect for Marriage Act, which basically is a pro gay marriage bill. I'm not saying that the church is perfect. It has its issues. I think Sanderson is a very poor target to talk about those issues. He tends to stay in his lane. And I think if the church had a better position, he would have a better position. So I really don't see the value in bagging on him. But the other thing I wanted to talk about as far as the article goes is that I'm really struggling to figure out the issue with it. Like, I think part of it does come down ultimately just to the way it's written rather than necessarily the contents. Because there's this idea that if you don't have anything nice to say, you shouldn't say it at all, which I think is fine for interpersonal relationships, but I think it's terrible for art. I think it's very important to talk about why we like and we don't like things. I think that's really important. And I think when you abandon that work and you just let things happen, I think you're essentially leaving it to the market, and that can really distort things and take things in some very appalling directions. That's probably something I'm going to talk about more in a future video, but yeah, I think it's important to say, like, hey, this might be popular, but this is why I don't like it, or even this is unpopular, but this is why I'm passionate about it. It really cuts both ways. I would say that combining the personal observations about Sanderson with the critiques of his writing makes it come off as considerably more vindictive than it would be otherwise. And I thought that that was the problem. My initial reaction to this was that the problem was combining aesthetic criticisms with personal observations, and I thought that was the issue, but I'm not sure that's true. I think it's something that you probably wanna be careful about, but I think it's something that you definitely can do. I was also thinking about, a piece by the late Tom Wolfe called My Three Stooges, where he went after John Updike, Norman Mailer, and John Irving, and it is extremely mean. It's very, very, very personal, and it goes after their work really aggressively. But it's also a fantastic piece. I just wanted to go ahead and share a little bit of that. Was I saying that John Irving was untalented, just the way he said I was untalented? Not at all, I told Evan. John Irving is a talented writer. Norman Mailer is a talented writer. John Updike is a talented writer. All I'm saying is that they've wasted their careers by not engaging the life around them, by turning their backs on the rich material of an amazing country at a fabulous moment in history, instead of going out into the world, instead of plunging into the, to me, irresistibly lurid carnival of American life today in the here and now, instead of striding out with a Dionysian yea saying, as Nietzsche would have put it, into the raw, raucous, lust-soaked rout that throbs with amped-up octophonic tympanum. All around them, our old lions had withdrawn, retreated, shielding their eyes against the light, and turned inward to such subject matter as their own little crevice, i.e., the literary world, or such holy, ghostly stuff as the presumed thoughts of Jesus. So I think if you wanted to write that article, I think that's kind of how you write that article, right? You need to have like a focus. Throughout this, Tom Wolfe has a very, very clear idea of why he's writing. He has something that he cares about. He has an argument that he's making, and he's making it very clearly. And he's definitely getting personal, but everything he does, every attack he makes is toward a specific end. And so even if it's negative and even if it's in some cases quite cruel, it's still effective. And I think the other thing that helps is that he's, Tom fucking Wolfe, right? Because he's good enough that you have to take his opinion seriously, even if you don't agree with it. So, if you read this article and you're underwhelmed, I would seriously recommend checking out My Three Stooges. It appears in the collection Hooking Up, and I think it basically does everything this article tried to do, but, good. Anyway, those are my thoughts about the Jason K article. I would ask that if anybody sees this, that they don't yell at him on Twitter or Facebook or whatever, because he's probably having a pretty rough time of it already. But yeah, I just think that there's something worthwhile here, but this isn't the way to do it. This was just really disappointing. Maybe I should attack Brandon Sanderson. Somebody's got to do it.